So thank you everybody for coming here today. We want to thank you so much for making the time to join us for this webinar. My name is Doreen Zhao, and I'm in charge of knowledge management and marketing for MSC Anglophone Africa. Let me start off by just saying Happy New Year, in as much as we have moved so much into the month. And it is our hope that the year has kicked off for you on a positive note, despite all the challenges we've been facing, especially the greater part of 2020, and we still continue to face because of the outbreak of the global coronavirus pandemic. Now, just to mention, last week we had a workshop where we launched our reports on the assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on MSMEs, farmers and CICO agents in Kenya. That research was conducted in 3 rounds between July and December of 2020. Now, today, we want to take the conversation further. We want to now assess what is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on low and moderate income populations and MSMEs in Asia and Africa. This research was conducted in several countries, that would be Kenya, Uganda, Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Now, our report indicates some very interesting parallels and important differences between the impacts we are seeing here in Kenya and, for instance, those in India, Indonesia, or even Uganda. And we'll go touching on this in our discussion. We are very grateful to our generous donors, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Swiss Capacity Building Facility, SCBF, Mastercard Foundation, and Metlife Foundation for their support. Now, without further ado, allow me to walk you through our program for the session. So we'll kick off with a presentation on MSC's research on the impact of COVID-19 on low and moderate income populations and MSMEs in Africa and Asia, where we'll also touch on some very high-level recommendations, impact on income, expenses, household, and current coping strategies. This session will be led by Anup Singh. Anup is the regional head for MSC Anglophone Africa. After this, we shall move to our 2-round conversation with our panelists, who will also share their insights and knowledge on the same. Allow me to introduce our lineup of panelists for today, who we have drawn from distinguished regional and global organizations that advance financial inclusion for low and moderate income populations. We start off with Mike McCaffrey. He's the East and Southern Africa Regional Manager at United Nations Capital Development Fund, UNCDF. We have Evelyn Stark. She's the Financial Health Strategy Lead at Metlife Foundation. We have Mark Napier. He's the CEO of FSD Africa. And finally, Payal Dalal. She's the Senior Vice President, Social Impact International Markets for Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. Thank you very much for joining us today, our dear panelists. Now, this session will be moderated by MSC's Group Managing Director, Mr. Graham Wright. Now, after the first round of discussions, we shall have a brief Q&A session. So please use the chat box function to drop in your questions. And as we move along, we will consolidate and address them as much as time will allow us. After this, we'll now move to the second round of discussions with our panelists, followed by another short Q&A session after that. After this, we will bring the session to an end with some closing remarks by Swiss Capacity Building Facility CEO, Sitara Merchant. Now, that's a very quick highlight of how the session will flow. I hope we will we'll all enjoy it. For now, allow me to call on Anup Singh, Regional Head, MSC Anglophone Africa, to kick us off. Welcome, Anup.
Thank you so much, Doreen. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. You are joining from several places. Thank you so much for joining this webinar on impact of COVID-19 pandemic. As Doreen mentioned, we did various studies in 7 countries on assessing the impact of the pandemic on low and moderate income population and the MSMEs. And today I'm going to present a very high level consolidated feedback from those studies, the insights, lessons, as well as some of the general recommendations that we draw out of those studies. So the presentation is divided in 3 sections. We would start talking about what has been the impact of the pandemic on households and the businesses. This will be followed by what coping strategies are they using, both the households and the businesses, and then we'll talk about some of the recommendations. So let me start first with impact on households and businesses. And as I start talking about impact on households and businesses, let's start with a case study of Nasima. Nasima is a garment worker, a ready-made garment factory worker. This was before the pandemic. Her husband, he used to be a street vendor who had set up shop near the local police station, and he sold clothes over there. Now, as the outbreak of pandemic happened and there was economic impact on the garment factory, they had to shut down the business, and as a result, Nasima lost her job. Her husband also suffered because he used to put up the shop in the main market near the local police station. Because of the lockdowns and curfews, he was not able to sell during the lockdown and curfew period. And later on, police did not allow him to set up his shop at the previous location. Now, what we see here is that Nasima stopped earning because the factory was shut down. Also, the cost of basic household essentials also had gone up. We also saw that her husband's income halved because the advantage of the location was lost. Now, if we look at the government support, Nasima and her family received 5 kilograms of rice from the government in the 4 months starting April. Now, because the cost of living in the city has become unbearable, Nasima and her family had to move back to the rural location with their brother-in-law. And right now they are depending on the savings and financial help from relatives. Now, Nasima is not just a unique case. She represents millions of people who have been impacted because of the impact of COVID-19. What we have seen is that in our focus countries, 3/4 of low and moderate income households actually reported earning significantly lower than before COVID-19. And this is how the impact on income was. 72% of people in Uganda reported that their income reduced. If we look at the numbers around how many stopped earning wages, in Bangladesh, 31% people reported that they stopped earning wages. Around 18% people in Kenya reported losing job. And recently we did this study, the third round study of Kenya, to look at the MSMEs and the farmers and the cash in, cash out agent. And the situation is pretty terrible there as well. The government is reporting that about 2 million people have lost jobs in the last 6 months. So as people started to have a dip in their income, because the low and moderate income households, they reported that there was a dip of about 50% in their income in July 2020. What they started doing was they started thinking about some of the coping strategies. The first one was to reduce the expenses. So they started controlling expenses. They borrowed from the shopkeepers and suppliers. Over time, the access to credit from these sources, from the shopkeeper, suppliers, and the informal sources also has dwindled significantly. They opted for new sources of income. They diversified businesses to sell essential items because essential items sale was allowed by the government. And some of them, around 5 to 7%, started using digital mediums to sell. On the knowledge and awareness front, what we have seen is that the government efforts and the initiatives have yielded results, although there are quite a number of misconceptions that need to be resolved. So people relied on television, radio, and social media as sources of information. If we look at television as source of information, 88% of people in India actually use television to find out more about the pandemic and how to save themselves from getting infected. The concern is that because there has been an increased reliance on the proximal local influencers, the friends, the families, the people in the society, in the community, there are also chances that there has been some misinformation spreading around. And the government needs to start thinking about how to utilize the local influencers so that some of the misinformation issues can be mitigated. So moving further, we have seen that there has been quite good adoption of the precautionary measures. So people did report that they started practicing social distancing. And if we look at the measures and practices, we see social distancing is about 80% in 3 cases in Bangladesh, Uganda, and India. In Kenya, it is 71%. One of the issues that we also found out from the study is that in the dense agglomerations in the slums, it is very difficult to observe social distancing. The other thing is that now we have also noticed that people's fear of the disease has reduced significantly. So they are a bit more optimistic that perhaps the economy is going to become better in the future when they don't have an answer. They have also reported that there is reduced fear of the disease and there is reduced use of helpline number. The issue is that as the vaccination drive is being conducted by the government, we'll have to start thinking about how do we engage with people, how do we enhance their awareness through communication campaigns so that they know where to go for the vaccination, how to get yourself enrolled, and so on and so forth. So moving forward, if we take a spotlight approach on gender, what we have seen is that women have been impacted more than men. So 69% of women compared to 58% reported that their income has increased. So there is an economic impact. There is an impact on the access to healthcare as well. Like in Indonesia, when we did this study, we found out that more women were not able to access the healthcare facilities, the hospitals, and the doctors. The domestic work has significantly increased for women. So 34% of women reported that the domestic work has increased most for women compared to men. And the last one, which is very important, is around the instances of domestic violence. So we have seen that because women are now trapped in their homes with their abusers, the instant of domestic gender-based violence has increased for women. So moving on to the enterprise segment, let's talk about Philip. So Philip runs a fruit stall in the City Park Market in Nairobi. He has a family of 5. He supports his old parents who live in the village. And since the outbreak of the COVID-19, because of the fact that there were not many customers coming to the fruit stall, his business has been severely impacted. And because of the supply chain disruptions, the cost of goods have also increased substantially for him. And what we are seeing is that the customer footfall is almost a quarter of what it used to be before COVID-19. His wife, who used to work as a receptionist, she also lost her job. There is an increase in income, decrease in income, and a significant increase in the household expenses because now the kids are staying at home. There needs to be arrangement made so that they can study from home using cellular devices or laptops. So with all this economic quandary, Philip decided to move back to village with his family. The other issue that Philip is facing is that his regular financial institution with whom he has been interacting and transacting for over 12 years have received access to finance, access to credit severally. They have stopped lending, and now Philip doesn't have any access to credit to revive his business. So again, Philip is not unique. Most of the enterprises did have the similar kind of sentiments. 17% of businesses that we surveyed in the focus countries, they mentioned that they closed due to the local restrictions or because of the low demand. And we have also seen that in urban areas, there are greater social restrictions. There is much more of layoffs happening from different businesses. Hence, people have been moving to hometowns and villages. And we did see quite poignant pictures from the mass exodus that happened from the urban areas to the rural areas in India. So if we look at the impact on business operations on MSMEs, about 59% of people did mention in Kenya that the business hours reduced significantly for them and hence they could not sell. The other issue was that the income was impacted because of low customer footfall. The average customer demand had reduced because the purchasing power, there has been a reduction in the purchasing power, and also because of the restrictions on the number of hours the business could operate. Now, we did look at the income side. Let's look at what happened to the supply chain side. So we saw quite significant supply chain disruptions happening. And in fact, in Kenya, it is much more pronounced if we see from the graph. 73% of MSMEs reported that there has been supply chain disruptions. If we look at the case of India and Indonesia, about 44% MSMEs did report that there has been a supply chain disruption. So essentially, let's try to understand why the supply chain disruption was happening. So countries which are dependent on export, there was not enough transportation that was happening. Even if the ships arrived at the port, because of the travel restrictions, the trucks could not come in from the port to the main cities cities and town in the country. And also, even for the local local goods, because the production was stopped, because the companies were not working, there were not enough goods in the market to sell. If we look at the expenses, on one side we see that there has been a decline in income, and on the other side we see that there has been a rise in expenses. What further complicated the situation for MSMEs is that most of them did used to borrow from supplier. So it used to be that they would purchase the goods on credit from the supplier and pay in the next cycle. There has been a significant decline in the availability of supplier credit as well. And this is largely because suppliers are facing higher bad loans or bad, they are not able to recover as much from the enterprises as they used to do. And also their business has been impacted in the overall economic impact to the enterprises. So if we look at the rise in the business cost, what we see is that the cost of supplies increased significantly. Like in Kenya, 53% MSMEs reported increase in cost of supplies. In India, 43% reported that the cost of supplies have gone up. Lastly, as much as on the business front, the MSMEs were impacted, on the household front also they were impacted because of the fact that the household expenses had increased. There was the whole focus on food, health, and sanitation supplies for the families, and also to take care of education of children. People in the household were losing jobs, so there was further reduction in the income of the household. So if we look at this graph, in Indonesia, 34% MSMEs just reported that their household expenses have increased. Now, having looked at the impact of COVID-19 on the households and businesses, let's look at the coping strategies that the households and businesses used. So for the low and moderate income populations, they started adopting the precautionary measures so that they at least save themselves from the infection. They reduced their expenses significantly. So 75% of respondents said that they have reduced the purchase of discretionary items and focused only on essentials. 77% women said that they are using controlling expenses as one of their coping strategies. Low and moderate income households also received support from the government. So there was in form of cash, food grains, and waiver of utility fees. And in fact, in some countries, we also saw that the central bank issued directives to the financial sector that they have to reduce the cost for digital payments and provide loan moratoria. We also saw an increase in use of digital payments. So the users started to adopt digital payments and also installed new digital payment applications. 16% of respondents reported diversifying income sources and opting for a new source of income as a coping strategy amongst the low and moderate income households. Now let's look at how did MSMEs cope with the situation. So the first step that MSMEs took was to optimize their staff or their benefits. So we saw that entrepreneurs reported a reduction in staff numbers to almost zero in several countries, including India and Kenya. They started to diversify their business and started offering new products and services. In some cases, we saw that entrepreneurs actually started selling more of goods that are in high demand and reduced the variety that is available in their shops. They received financial support. So some micro and small enterprises receive financial support from the government, and also they banked on their social network, their relatives, friends, neighbors, and suppliers to meet their financial needs. The entrepreneurs borrowed from financial institutions, and some of them actually sold household assets to be able to have that liquidity so that they can invest in the business in terms of working capital. We also saw that enterprises started using social media like WhatsApp and Facebook to communicate as well as accept business orders. They started using the door-to-door delivery person so that they can deliver goods from their shops or warehouses to the customers who would want them. And in some cases, we also saw that entrepreneurs established partnerships with the e-commerce players and began to operate as the sellers on these platforms. And last one, because there was supply chain disruption, we saw that some of the enterprises increased the price of items sold. And essentially because there was supply and demand issue, there was more of demand, less of supply. So let's quickly look at some of the general recommendations that we make basis our studies in different countries. So for low and moderate income households, we think that the awareness and knowledge can further be enhanced using the campaigns through the use of local influencers, as well as using multimodal approach, whether it is WhatsApp, whether it is television, radio, the social network, and so on and so forth. So the core part that needs to be communicated right now is about why is it important to wear your mask properly, because in most of the countries we saw that the respondents have not been wearing their mask properly. And going forward, we would also need to communicate how the vaccination drive is going to happen and what benefits they would have. Then on prevention, on the preventive action, the government would need to ensure that the quality and supply of preventive items is adequate. There is also a need to involve the youth and also to communicate why it is important to still continue with the prevention measures and not to become too relaxed about it. In terms of economic impact, so the measures to manage the economic impact, there can be cash transfers and waivers. We have seen cash transfers and waivers in several countries by the governments. We are also seeing that some public-private collaborations are coming up, which take care of equipping people with digital skills and so on, so that they can cope with the situation. And lastly, on the gender focus, so we believe that gender has to be central in the cash transfer, as well as all the benefits that the governments and the private sector is working on or implementing. There needs to be access to finance as well as access to digital platforms for the women households as well as the entrepreneurs. On the MSMEs front, there is a need to support the income of MSMEs, and that can be through some kind of arrangement on cash transfers to the nano and micro enterprises. This may be also that there can be a provision of concessionary loan that is given to the nano and micro enterprises who can then stock up and revive their businesses. There can be focus on having preference to the MSMEs on the public procurement, and the public and private sector can actually collaborate to develop a multi-agency platform that would support MSMEs to begin to think about the whole digital transition, whole digital journey to continue to sell online. On the expenses side, we believe that what would work is to provide incentives and tax reliefs to revive sectors. We have seen that by the end of 2020, most of the governments had actually had stopped the tax relief that were earlier given. I think it needs to be expanded further, because in our workshop on Kenya, we did hear from our panelists saying that the industry will take at least one more year to revive itself because there has been massive impact on the economy. Further, government can expedite the payment of pending bills and refunds related to the taxes and duties. There can be short-term waiver or deferred payments of fees for utilities. On access to finance, so there is now a need to take a serious look at credit guarantee schemes, because through this loan protection guarantees, financial institutions would have much more comfort lending to the MSMEs. The financial institution, together with support from the multilateral organizations and donors, can start thinking about creating concessionary loans and also designing suitable products that would work on digital platforms. In terms of informal sector, we have seen that quite significant number of enterprises in the focus countries are informal in nature. Perhaps an opportunity that is presented before us is to use the cash transfer that would happen to informal nano and micro enterprises to formalize them through a low-cost digital platform, which can be used to identify, verify, and register them. And apart from the incentivization through the cash transfer, also the access to finance, access to loans would be another incentive that would work as we think about formalization of these informal, unlicensed enterprises. Then there is also the need to design and implement low-cost innovative communication collaterals that would increase awareness about COVID-19. So MSC, we designed comic books for low and moderate income populations for cash in, cash out agent, as well as MFI staff. And we did see that it had been very, very impactful in making people understand how to prevent them from the infection. Lastly, there is a need to promote digitization and digital payments, and there would be a requirement to build the capacity. So earlier I stated that some of the enterprises have started to use digital payments and have partnered with the digital platforms. The others who could not do mentioned that lack of awareness, lack of capacity and skill prevents them to benefit from the digital communication, the digital marketing and digital payments. With this, I would like to end. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please do feel free to drop in the chat box.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Anup. That was very insightful. Given by the number of questions, there are quite a number of questions in the chat group that have come out of that. You've obviously captured the key insights from the research. And it's also interesting to see that you picked up some issues that are happening here in Kenya and what is happening across the globe. And then again, just to mention to our panel viewers today that we have put together a very detailed comparative study. It delves deeper into what Anup has just shared with us, and it's available on our website. I will also drop for you the links as the link to this report so that you can be able to look into it and see what more you can be able to pick from there in the chat box as we move along. Now, allow me to hand over to now Graham Wright, who's the Group Managing Director for MSC, to take us through our next session, which is a panel discussion. Welcome, Graham.
Thank you, Doreen. Thank you, Anup, for a great presentation. So much information and data, almost difficult to assimilate. But we now have a stellar panel, and I want to thank them again for joining us. And we'll dive into the first round of questions, which is on the impact of COVID-19 and the coping strategies. And Evelyn, if I may start with you, what's your reading from Metlife's work on the impact of the pandemic on people's financial health, which I know Metlife is a leader on, and what are their attitudes to formal financial services in that context?
Great, thanks, Graham and Anup and the whole MicroSave team. It was a great presentation, and also the website is full of really interesting information. So what's interesting is I thought I would also look at other countries and markets that we're working in and see how it tracks with yours. And it's extremely similar. One of the biggest coping mechanisms we've seen is actually an increase in savings, in people wanting to put aside any cash that they can into more formal products, which has been really interesting. And I think it fits with what you said. There's more people at home, so you definitely want to get the cash out of the house. So whether you leave it on a mobile wallet or get it into your credit union, we have been seeing quite a lot increase in savings. And so I think that's some real potential for formalization on that side. On the credit side, I think this is where things are going to get very interesting. We've seen low demand for credit right now, but pick up on the MSME side, looking for credit to start restarting businesses. We've done a couple of studies and seen a couple of other studies on hope and future orientation, and people are incredibly hopeful that businesses are going to come back and that they're going to restart their businesses, which means they are going to need that credit. And if the easiest credit to get is not good credit, if it's expensive or consumer oriented, that's our concern, is trying to ensure that the good credit that comes back into the market is stronger. So again, I like your recommendations on that. So I'll leave it there.
Evelyn. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the importance of credit, I mean, as far as we can see, all forms of MSMEs and indeed farmers have decapitalized significantly just to feed their families and keep nose above water. So there will be a huge demand, and as you say, the trick will be to ensure that the credit is tailored appropriately for MSMEs to recapitalize. Mike, if I could turn to you, I mean, you've specialized in Africa for a long time and extremely knowledgeable about it. What are, from your perspective, are the key highlights of the government and donor response to COVID-19 in Africa, and how adequate have they been in addressing the financial crisis that low and moderate income populations face?
Thanks, Graham, and thanks, Anoop, and to the work that you guys are doing. I think, one of the hard parts about this pandemic is that a lot of, the field teams, the field operations that we have been pulled back. And for you guys to, stay on the frontier and bring us this knowledge and insight as to what's going on and where we need to prepare for responses is absolutely invaluable. Some key takeaways from what you presented. One, I thought it was really interesting to look at the information dissemination, especially in Kenya, to see 73% of people learning about things like social distancing through social media. I think really shows some of the progress we've had in bridging that digital divide. Also, just how crushing this has been in terms of elevated costs for business, elevated costs in the household, more responsibility in the household with schools shut, and then increased cost, and then reduced income. And so to really, it really hits home in terms of this is going to be a long-term solution in terms of building back and, figuring out for a lot of these low-skilled workers who lost their jobs, as we build back, what does that mean in terms of recreating a better economy? And then, also in terms of, really the need to make more progress and looking at that, 1 to 3% of those countries or MSMEs in those countries being able to pivot to online services. That's really low and something that, I think deserves a lot of our attention. From a donor and a governmental perspective, it's been a real call to action and a desire for coordination. I think a lot of us on this call have been in the digital space for a while, and to see a lot of other players come in, a lot of urgent interest in digitalizing everything today. And I think that's been great. I saw, for example, the World Bank has been tracking 164, I think, social protection schemes that have been enhanced or built during this period. I think it's been incredibly humbling for us. The learning has increased, the level of sophistication of the conversation has increased. But for example, we're working with a SADC country that was really proud as they transferred their cash in hand social protection scheme to mobile money, only to realize there was no mobile money agents in the rural areas, and they had to send taxis out to the villages to bring people into the city to cash out. For us also looking at, we've had really impressive gains in financial inclusion on the top line, but what has that meant about the equality of inclusion? And so we're just looking at like some of the Findex statistics from Zambia, and overall inclusion, digital inclusion has gone up, but that divide, has increased for women, has increased for people who only have a primary school education, has increased for low-skilled workers. And so how are we investing in these marginalized communities to make sure that they're resilient as well when something like this happens? I think it's exposed a lot of the areas where we still are unprepared and need to make progress. The social protection schemes are hopeful in a sense, but if we look at East and Southern Africa, we're talking about them reaching 10% of the population, maybe on average. And so in order to scale the magnitude of response we need, they, minimally need to be complemented. If we look at, the digital response, if we look at humanitarian response from UN agencies, only about 3% of cash transfers are going through systems like mobile money right now. And so, these seem like real areas where, people who have been working in digital and people who are doing these kind of humanitarian responses, we really need to coordinate more. And yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Great, Mike. And I'm so pleased you brought up the digital divide. It's a personal obsession of mine. I think it's really worrying, and we have to, really be proactive in addressing this problem. Otherwise, I really worry that we'll have a situation where those who are privileged enough to be the right side of the digital divide and have access to all the new resources that the internet and apps can provide will move ahead, and the other side of the digital divide will be left further and further behind in remote rural areas and so on. Turning to Mark, FSDA is really the key market facilitator in Africa, or drives market facilitation. Mark, how do you see COVID impacting the inclusive financial sector?
Sorry, just unmute myself. Thank you, Graham, and thank you to everybody at Microsave for this fantastic data. Really good to see the cross-country comparisons, actually, the differences and also the similarities. Really rich indeed. So many thanks and many congratulations. Okay, so I was thinking about how to answer this question. I don't want to create the impression that the questions were posed in advance or anything, but one of the things that I think is important to disentangle, perhaps, is the general message about the impacts, the economic impact of the pandemic on the people who the inclusive financial system is trying to serve, right? And I think rightly they get that gets our primary interest. But to disentangle that really from the financial system, the inclusive financial system itself. And so that means we have to look both at the demand side and the supply side. So if you'll allow me to do that, I'll have a go at looking at the impacts really from a household level and from a sectoral level, and then maybe just to go back and look at the system in general. But my feeling is that while there is nothing good in this pandemic, I mean, there really is. It's awful. We all know that, and the effects are truly dispiriting. Actually, the financial system, the inclusive financial system, I think, has proved probably to be pretty resilient. And I think when we look back on this period, I think we need to, really understand what might have happened if the efforts that we had all put in place to create a genuinely inclusive financial system had not been there. The counterfactual, I think, is pretty awful if you think about it. And I'll explain what I mean in just a minute. But I guess the general pattern on the household side is that the people who have suffered worst, and we know this from the work that we've done in Africa, and it's borne out in what you've said as well in the Microsave papers, is really that those who are in the urban informal sector, who depend on the passing trade, who sell things on the streets, who are the motorbike traders, those are the guys who have suffered most, and particularly from a decline in cash incomes. The FSD network conducted a series of scenario planning exercises, actually, which I certainly commend you to have a look at. And the scenarios exercise in Uganda highlighted in particular the reality that people went into this, those sorts of people went into this pandemic with incredibly little cash savings to fall back on. I mean, really little. So even the most wealthy, 20% of the population had, $20 in the bank really to fall back on average. And so the margin of error, which was of course blown apart completely by this pandemic, was and is and always will be incredibly slim. And I think we just need to bear that in mind. And of course, very drastic lockdowns in places like Uganda obviously made that very, very much worse, which was also a message that came through from Bangladesh. But then you also look at the access that people have to mobile money and to savings groups. And actually, you realize that those instruments are what cause people to be able to get through this, I think. And I think we need to do more research to prove this out. But I really, really believe that mobile money is in many ways the sort of mangrove forest here that soaked up the force of the tsunami and allowed people to get through. And I think I would love some clever people to dream up some research to really look at that. To show that actually, had we not had mobile money, the situation would have been truly disastrous, I think. And then we must also think about savings groups, where even the poorest 80% of the population are members of savings groups, sort of a third to a half of the poorest 80% of people in Uganda are members of savings groups. And again, that provides the social and financial capital to fall back on. So I think we need to remember that. Totally agree on the message on gender, and you know, when you consider that women's savings are about 60% less than men's savings on that very, very small number, and they have to look after the children, and they can no longer rely on remittances from other people and so on. So very difficult situation for women, but not all bad. And so again, if you go over the border into Rwanda, the scenarios exercised in Rwanda showed incredible increases in take-up of P2P transfers, both in values and volumes, 5 times increase between April and March. April and March, 5 times in value and volumes. And MTN says that actually a lot of those increases have sustained. Merchants, the average transaction sizes increased by a significant amount, like 9 times. In that period as well, which showed that people sort of were nudged into using electronic transactions in merchants. Very exciting, and a lot of those benefits have continued. At a sectoral level, I think we all know that some sectors have fared very badly, and others have done a bit better. You know, tourism, transport, aviation, disastrous. Where we've been active has been on textiles and garments. Again, that case study, very moving case, says that we've been working in Ethiopia on textile and garments. And I think the message here is that what COVID has highlighted is that SMEs, quite apart from their access to credit, are part of an economic system. And I think what COVID has done is to demonstrate very starkly that that economic system has collapsed with grave consequences for SMEs, for example, those SMEs who make textiles and garments. So there in Ethiopia, we're selling to Europe and the US, and massive sort of furloughs and shop closures and things like that on the high streets in the US and Europe. So that's led to huge job losses, but also they haven't been able to even get their supplies from China and India and elsewhere. So we put in place actually a furlough scheme for factories in Ethiopia to try and help them sustain through the worst of this. We, being the UK government and the German government, are providing cash to factories to help offer some liquidity. And then on the financial system side, really, I suppose the pattern here is of extreme lending caution by financial institutions, which has resulted in inevitably SMEs losing out more than others. So over 60% of the loans that have been restructured under the central bank scheme in Kenya have been in the SME sector. And that's a very big number. But the result is now that banks are highly liquid. And so on the positive side, and we must always try and look for the positives, actually, the risk in Africa of a financial crash as well as an economic crash and a health crash is probably limited. So that is good news. And even in the microfinance sector as well, the message is more mixed, really. Again, we worked with Microfinanza like a lot of other people did, and the message there was perhaps a little bit surprising. Many microfinance institutions, were experiencing really significant improvements in their liquidity as their loan portfolios have declined because they've been cautious too. And so actually, they haven't been doing too badly, although they're citing that they may things may get worse in the future, but that there may be solvency risks in time. So I guess what I'm really saying is that when we look at the systemic impacts of this pandemic on the financial system and the inclusive financial system itself, I think there's a lot that we can take away and be proud of and keep investing in. Because I think it has proved to be a very robust underpinning for people's livelihoods here, and I think we should be quite proud of that, even though the economic backdrop is really very dire.
Great. I mean, that's a really positive picture and a very comprehensive one. Thank you, Mark. I hope that indeed that liquidity in banks and MFIs will in due course encourage them to get over their concerns about the risk of lending in order to recapitalize these MSMEs as the pandemic recedes, because that's going to be key, I'm sure. You also mentioned the gender impacts, and I wanted to ask Payal from the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth specifically about the impact of the pandemic on MSMEs, and particularly women entrepreneurs, and what sort of challenges she sees for the growth of the MSME sector post-COVID-19. Payal, this is an area of your expertise and passion, so I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Graham, and thanks to the MicroSave team for such a fantastic event and indeed really rich insights. I think the truth, Graham, is that evidence on the impact of this pandemic on micro and small businesses is only beginning to emerge. I think we've seen some really stark and worrying data coming out and some predictive numbers. Andy at the Aspen Institute is saying that 42% of micro and small businesses globally are at risk of failure in the next 6 months. And more alarmingly, what we have seen from the International Trade Center is that some have already begun to fail, and that 1 in 5 small firms might go bankrupt in the next 3 months. So pretty dire numbers and statistics. And to a point made earlier, micro and small businesses are trying to pivot as quickly as they can, and they're taking unprecedented action, whether to avoid permanent closure. So they might be downsizing, they might be temporarily suspending their business, and certainly digital has been a huge trend. I've been really delighted to hear that everyone is thinking about this through a gender lens as well, because it is so critically important. And what we found, Mastercard has something called the Index of Women Entrepreneurs. What we found is, irrespective of an economy's wealth, the level of development, size, geographic location, women have been disproportionately more vulnerable to the economic consequences of this pandemic. I know the International Trade Center did some really good work, and they revealed that about 64% of businesses owned by women were strongly affected, compared to 52% of businesses owned by men. So you can already see that there is quite a significant difference between male-led businesses and women-led businesses. And what we're seeing in our own work and in our own data is that 90% of women entrepreneurs have seen a decrease in sales. So I think the truth is, Graham, that inequality and exclusion have always affected women-owned and women-run small businesses, but it's been exacerbated by COVID. And it's issues like financial barriers, inferior or limited access to business management skills, adequate mentorship opportunities in business education, limited access to networks, limited access to markets and supply chains and technology. These have just gotten more dire because of the pandemic. In terms of the macro challenges that I'm seeing that are really constraining the growth of micro and small businesses in the pandemic, and I'd say this is applicable both to women-led and male-led, I'd hone in on 3. One is around access to skills. and capacity, one is around access to finance, and one is around access to markets. And of course, underpinning all of this is the backdrop of an increasingly digital world. So if we think about access to skills and capacity, we have seen evidence that shows that better management is significant for firm productivity, and even for very smaller enterprises, using better business practices makes them more profitable and grow faster over time. But the truth is that a lot of small firms just lack basic business skills like record keeping, marketing, and budgeting. The second bucket is around access to and usage of finance. And this has been touched on by a number of the panelists already, but access to finance is really critical to micro and small business development. But there really is a dearth of financial solutions that account for the nuanced and diverse needs of various types of micro and small enterprises. So if you think about firms seeking credit, a lot of these micro and small businesses fall into that missing middle where they're too big for microfinance, but too small for commercial banks, meaning they lack the funds to grow through expansion, they can't scale their operations, they can't increase their working capital, and they can't acquire assets. And often they're just deemed to be too risky. And I do think risk aversion among financial institutions is on the rise. And they're deemed too risky because of this information inequality issue. There's just a lack of transaction history or credit scores. And in this increasingly digital world, it does seem that micro and small businesses are facing limited options for simple transactions like accepting digital payments. And this is really limiting as we think about the rise in e-commerce, which is really a must in this digital world. Third challenge is around access to markets. So accessing new domestic international markets or participating in global value chains really provide opportunities for micro and small businesses to increase their productivity and, of course, achieve economies of scale. But oftentimes, especially on the micro and the small side, limited size, resources, managerial structures, and even geographic location can result in informational, technological, and administrative barriers that really make it difficult for these micro and small businesses to comply with quality standards or to deal with the connectivity issues or the infrastructure constraints. So I think you have these three challenges: skills and capacity, access to finance, and markets, that have been incredibly durable, incredibly widespread. The challenges that existed before the pandemic have been exacerbated. And what I'd say is that playing out now against the backdrop of the changing landscape for business is digitization, right? And digitization is shorthand for a host of changes, including low-cost global communications and networking, new employment relationships, platform business models, virtual and integrated supply chains, innovative finance, automation, big data, AI. It's all reshaping how business is done, even at the micro and the small business level. And so the onus now is on every micro and small business to digitize, not only to survive, but to really thrive in this challenging landscape. And so businesses need things that are going to help them promote themselves on social media and to communicate differently with their customers and to digitize their internal processes. And this is just going to require, Graham, new capabilities and a significant amount of time. And that's something that micro and small businesses didn't have pre-pandemic, and they certainly even have less of post-pandemic. So I will stop there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great summary. And what a challenge you set us, because, enabling that digital transformation, particularly of micro businesses, is going to be really tough. I mean, really tough. Something, again, that I've been particularly on NUP has done a lot of work on from our side. And I agree with you entirely. And I think that also that digitization can actually help with the risk aversion of financial institutions as well, because of course, if you have a digital footprint, you reduce the risk.
You're generating data.
Exactly. Right. So I don't know whether Doreen or Anup is going to lead the questions from the chat box, but I hope the majority of them, particularly the challenging ones, will be delivered to the panel, and I'll handle the really easy ones.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Graham. So quite a lot of questions. Thank you so much for the questions that are streaming in. Maybe I can just take the first question and address this to Mike. Mike, there's a question that came through while you were speaking, and it goes, would the loan demand be different along the poverty levels of the households and MSMEs? So they just want to know what would be the demand levels along the households and MSMEs. Mike, over to you.
The demand for loans, I don't know. I would kindly redirect that maybe to Anoop or Graham, who.
Okay, maybe
have
Graham,
done
you
this
can
research.
take that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I really understand the question. Are we seeking to differentiate between sort of consumption loans and business loans?
Yes, yes. What they're asking is that what would the loan demand be? Would the loan demand be different along poverty levels of the households and MSMEs? It's between the households and the MSMEs.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think is the answer to that. I think Evelyn made a really good point, which sort of reflects what Mark saw in Uganda in terms of the growth of savings. We've seen this in Asia particularly, I think a little bit less in Africa, but there has been a real effort despite the challenges that all these businesses and households are facing. They've really been trying to save. And that to me reflects a recognition that they know that credit is going to be tough to come by, and that things are, may well get worse before they get better. But I mean, I'm quite sure there'll be differential needs for credit. My biggest concern, as I said, was ultimately we need to get businesses and farmers recapitalized. And at the moment, we've got a sort of, a real contraction of capital supply because the banks and financial institutions are so risk averse. And I worry that this will drive people into consumer digital lending. And, as those of you who follow MSC's work, we have fairly strong opinions about the benefits of digital consumer lending as is currently playing out across Africa. And there's a huge opportunity to improve the quality of the products and indeed collection methodologies and so on of these digital lenders. I'd like to open it up to others on the panel to comment though, please. Not all at once.
Yeah, if there's any comments, feel free. Otherwise, I think I'm going to throw this one to, let me see, this came through. I remember, Payal, you were talking about digitization. There's a question that was posed when Anoop was speaking, and I think maybe you can speak a little bit into this. So the question being asked is digital payments, yes, are in place, but in the absence of an ecosystem, cash is the final destination. What would be your thoughts around this, especially with digitization?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it goes to the point that you can't just digitize one part of the ecosystem. You have to take a full ecosystem play. So if we're looking at the garment context, which I know that's where we started this conversation in Bangladesh, if you're digitizing the payroll of garment workers, you have to make sure that the merchants around those garment factories also accept digital payments. And so what I think it really goes to is not only do we have to work at an ecosystem level, but we also have to work in tandem, in cooperation with each other. Digitization is not something that I can at Mastercard do in isolation, nor something that Evelyn can do at Metlife Foundation. We have to find a way to collaborate to look at all of the different facets and think about digitizing as a whole, as opposed to just one part of the supply chain.
Thank you. Great.
Mike, would you like to come in on that? Because I know this is an area of your expertise.
You're very kind. Yeah, I mean, that is the core philosophy of UNCDF, our Inclusive Digital Economies program, is that, a lot of the work we've done in the past in terms of digital financial inclusion has been, in a quite laudable phase one in terms of really opening accounts and opening this digital payments ecosystem, but we really need to ask the question for what. And if it's not, if there's not a use case for it in terms of getting better healthcare services, getting better education services, paying for agricultural inputs, we see the fairly low registration numbers we see, and with mobile money after about 12 years of development, we only have about 4 countries in the world where population penetration in adults is over 50%. We see, massive dormancy in mobile money and bank accounts. And so it's really a more systematic approach to, saying it's the digital economy that makes these payment systems useful, and vice versa. And I think, one of the big takeaways for governments and people on the policy level is that I think a lot of our past work has shown amazing kind of numerical results in terms of scaling parts of the ecosystem. And now we're going to have to dig in deeper and say, okay, well, we need to bring the whole healthcare system or the whole agricultural value chain with it. And that's a much heavier lift. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mike. Maybe-
Evelyn, final thoughts?
Yes.
Oh, I was going to say, and just to be a little on the contrarian side, I don't think we're getting rid of cash anytime soon. It has a lot of benefits, and people are part of the ecosystem, and people like cash. There are some markets where people have moved on from cash, but I do worry on an over insistence on everything going digital. I agree with Mike. Large ticket items, I fully agree. Digital works great. But I'm here in New York, and pre-pandemic, a bunch of restaurants, fast food restaurants, went cashless, right? Effectively cutting low-income people off of being able to shop at cashless restaurants, right? So there are so many ways we can exacerbate the digital divide by over-reliance on digital. So I'm certainly not saying that I don't want a digital and don't see the value of digital, but I do think that we have to be a little bit concerned sometimes on how far we go with this. And, again, really talk to the end user consumer who we're all concerned about, and, really keeping them at the center of this discussion.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Evelyn, for that. Maybe just over to Mark. Just a question here. There's a huge borrowing from lower income people during the pandemic, especially through mobile loans, and we have had banks, microfinance institutions rescheduling the payback as most are unable to pay during and continuing the pandemic. Perhaps from your perspective, what impact will it have on the economy if this continues? That is, we're talking about the unrecoverable credit facilities.
Well, I actually wonder how much additional borrowing that really means. I'd like to understand that figure a little bit more, because I think the general feeling is that the general wisdom or received wisdom has been, hasn't it, that people actually make very rational decisions, and when they see that their circumstances are challenged, that's precisely when you don't want to encumber yourself with significant borrowings. That's not to say, the sort of super short-term borrowing, as in sort of cash flow management type borrowing, isn't happening. And I'm sure a lot of that is, which is why I'm sort of saying mobile money is incredibly important like that, because you can effectively do tiny overdraft type loans between friends and sort of get away with it, sort of thing. But I think the bigger ticket borrowing, I would really doubt that that's really happening. And of course, they're not, financial institutions are not pouring money into people whose profile is risky, and certainly not last year. So I'm not so sure about that, actually. I suspect that financial, I suspect that yeah. The second point, maybe just to add to this, is of course the general economic impact is probably going to be quite minimal, I think, because the amount of money that poorer people can actually borrow is tiny in the scheme of things, really. And so the actual sort of macroeconomic impact of that is going to be quite modest. But which is not to say that sort of small amounts of credits in targeted places in the economy aren't important. Of course they are, but I just feel like I'd like more information on the background to that question, actually, more evidence of that, because I'm sort of slightly doubtful that that really is the reality.
Okay, Graham, you'd like to say something, or I have one question.
No,
yes.
I just make one observation, which is that poor people, whenever possible, pay back their loans. Right now, they may be struggling, but you can safely assume they will do their level best to repay the loans as soon as they find, the income to do so. And this is what worries me, is if we risk being in a chicken and egg situation where if they don't have the small amount of working capital to recapitalize their businesses, they may never be able to get to a stage where they can repay the loan that they took out in December 2019 or whenever. And that's my biggest concern, actually.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Allow me to pose one question that has just come through for Payal. So they're asking, you've mentioned about the importance of MSMEs to pursue digitization and overall business skills improvement in order to survive the new normal. Now, are there any programs available led by Mastercard Foundation, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, that tackle that challenge? Are there pre-investment terms and conditions in form of trainings and grants, for instance? Payal, to you.
Sure, and just to reiterate, I'm with the Center for Inclusive Growth, not the Mastercard Foundation. I don't want to misrepresent an institution I don't work for, but yes, we have been doing a lot of experimentation with capacity building over a number of different modalities in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, and in Asia Pacific. We have been looking at hybrid models that blend touch and tech, but we've also been looking at pure tech models. So we have been experimenting with SMS training. We have been experimenting with interactive chatbots. We've been experimenting with video training. And one of the things that we have found is that in general, if you look at the literature, digital training, there is a low level of engagement. So you have to think through how you're going to incentivize engagement. What we've seen in our own data is that we've actually had relatively good engagement because we always try to do training alongside something else. So training alongside a financial service product, for example. But there's still a gender differential. And so what we have found is that women entrepreneurs behave differently and interact differently than male entrepreneurs when it comes to digital training. And one of the things that has really crystallized our own programmatic work is how important that connection, social connection, is for women entrepreneurs. So one of the things we did in India, for example, was we worked with Mandeshi to set up rural chambers of commerce. So women were building their skills, but they were also connecting with other rural entrepreneurs. Another thing we've done in the Middle East and also in Indonesia is we have worked with Mercy Corps to create something called Micro Mentor, which is a platform where entrepreneurs can come and say, I have a question or I need help on creating a business plan. And then there's a suite of mentors who are also business owners themselves who say, this is a match, I can help you. And it's mentorship, not in the grand meaning of it where, you and I are going to be mentees and mentors for a year. It's actually just very kind of short and quick engagements based on what a micro and small business needs. And we have seen during COVID the just acceleration of demand for that platform. We have had so many micro entrepreneurs across the Middle East and across Indonesia really raise their hand and say, I need help with pivoting my business. I need help with digitization. I need help with a new marketing plan. And we've seen some really effective data to show how impactful that modality is. I'll stop there, but that kind of gives you a sense of what we're seeing across our different regions.
Sure, thank you so much for that. If Graham and the panel will allow me to just, there are two questions here that are very specific to the report, the presentation that Anoop made. If I could just request him to just address one, which I think he would be the best place to address. Anoop, from the report, when you are presenting the report, there was a question that came in. So they're asking, were the findings disaggregated by sector? And if so, which sectors are most affected? For example, were those MSMEs in agriculture or transport more affected than the others? Anup, maybe you can just take this one.
Thank you. We haven't done like a graph in the report which says that which sector was more affected, but we have a general commentary in the report, most of the MSME reports, which talk about which were the sectors impacted. But nonetheless, what we did was we focused on low and moderate income households. We focused on MSMEs, on cash in, cash out agents, and farmers. So those were like broad categorization that we did. Within the MSME sector, what we found out is that at least for Kenya, I can say that, I mean, apart from those MSMEs that are in transportation, the MSMEs which were also focusing on the hospitality and also the trade of non-essential goods were mostly impacted.
Great. Thank you so much for that.
Graham, so shall we go back?
Yes, let me hand over back to you so that
let's go for round two. And
sure, over to you, Graham. Thank you so much.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about building resilience and the way forward. And just to give you a data point from the Kenya study on farmers, a combination of increases in costs associated with inputs and transportation and a decrease in prices due to reduced demand, we see that farmers' margins are being squeezed by 38%. So, and I suspect that will be reflected across a lot of sectors. So, in that context, let me turn to Evelyn again and ask her quickly, in the current crisis, how is this changing the strategies of Metlife Foundation to support the financial inclusion for the poor? And is there a need to refinance, financial inclusion as we've always done it, so to speak, given that COVID has undone years of inclusive finance initiatives? Evelyn.
So, I'm not sure that this is totally changing our focus, but I, if anything, I think it's an expansion and really committing more that move towards financial health as we define it, and as increasingly we're seeing other partners define financial health or financial well-being or whatever they want to call it, but really this outcome focus on areas like resilience, opportunities, day-to-day management, and then there's been a really great shift, I think, in a lot of the way people are thinking about agency, confidence, and subjective measures of households and small businesses. And the reason I think that that's important in the whole context of financial health and financial inclusion is if we want people to be confident in our products and services, then we have to really commit again to meeting their needs. And that goes back to what Mike is talking about as well, is really meeting them in the real economy. So if a farmer is buying seed or a trucker needs a truck, that's where we need to work with them. If they're going to the hospital, we need to work in the health sector. So I think this is, in a way, it goes back to integrated rural development or just integrated development as a whole. And the reason that we stopped doing that many, many years ago was this idea that everyone should be in their own swim lanes and, do what they do best. But I think, again, we're coming, what's old is new again. We're realizing we're all in the same pool. So you can have your swim lane, but, we have to work together. We have to figure out our role alongside and with others in the development sector. So it's not like low-income people. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, not like a low-income person says, today I'm going to think about my loaning, my borrowing behavior, and tomorrow I'm going to think about my agriculture. So it's at our level that we need to work together on this. And I do think that funders are more willing to coordinate and cooperate in some sectors, in some markets. I have seen increased requests for guarantee schemes, which we're definitely participating and looking at, and that is something that I probably wasn't doing 2 years ago. It's a shift in the way that we would work, and then I do think one of the areas that again am a little worried about is our microfinance institutions. So as much as we all do appreciate digital lenders, payment systems, the microfinance institution had a more holistic view of the client. In many cases, small banks in other countries have a more holistic view. They offer greater products. They offer that greater attachment to the real economy. But some of them just haven't kept up with the tech. Some of them have given up on the tech, and that is a big issue. How do we keep that real touch point in the community alive without supporting something that doesn't want to be supported? So, in Mexico, we're working with credit unions, which are roughly the equivalent of MFIs in that they're local and whatnot. And there has been a huge interest in figuring out how to do the tech, suffer infrastructure issues and lack of tech on both the institutional side and the client side. So I think that that's another area that we're driving towards, making sure that clients, low-income clients, aren't reduced to only their CICO agent, unless their CICO agent has access to that financial supermarket that we used to talk about. So that's why we're looking at things a little differently. I am happy to see that CGAP is focusing on this kind of area. The Queen's team at the UN is focusing on this broader area. CFI, obviously Microsave never left this area. So, I think we are seeing that it's up to funders like us and partners like you to figure out how to coordinate and cooperate on this real sector work. So.
Great, thanks, Evelyn. Yeah, I mean, for us, it's always been amusing, the elephant in the room of financial inclusion for what? And now, I think even pre-COVID, we were beginning to have to answer that question. Financial inclusion per se is not, no one gets out of bed in the morning going, yoo-hoo, I have a savings account. And I have a feeling that this pandemic will accelerate and us answering that question, or trying to answer that question, perhaps. So Mark, turning to you and FSDA, how can financial markets effectively address the financial constraints of the MSMEs that we've been discussing? And how should they be helping these segments survive and recover from the pandemic, particularly given their current risk aversion and so on?
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, so look, I mean, this question is probably about the sort of big guns of financial markets and what's the relevance of that lot, including the bigger commercial banks and perhaps even and capital markets, perhaps to the sort of sector we're talking about. But I just want to, if I may, go back to what we've just been talking about. And there was a good question from Samuel in the chat, which maybe we can come and look at later, really, about the relevance of about ACFTA, the trade agreement in Africa, and what all of this means for small businesses trying to participate in that. And it made me remember, and I'm not, this isn't a gratuitous commercial, but I do think there's a real need for sustained innovation in the new sort of distanced reality that we all operate in, and recognize that we're all, a lot of business practices are going to need to change. And businesses will just be run in a very different way, will be run and regulated and supported in very different ways. And again, back to the same point about that I think, Graham, you were talking about at the beginning about the digital divide, is that yeah, sure, we need to get to a more digitally enabled environment, but because we have to. But we also need to recognize that divide exists. But we're doing an interesting, working with DFS Labs, actually, we're doing an interesting sprint, sort of fintech sprint in Egypt, of all places. It's an unusual market for us, working with the central bank there, expressly to encourage innovation to address those very specific COVID-related challenges. So if you're a fintech that has a solution for things like KYC online, or for digital invoicing, or for cashless payments, then you'll be able to apply under that challenge for funding for your innovation. And I think we just need a lot more of that, basically, across Africa. And these are going to be tiny businesses, and hardly any of them will survive. But I think it's really important to try and get some stuff happening in there. So how do you get economies more resilient? Digitize them, especially in the lower end. But let's be mindful of the digital divide. Right, financial markets. Okay, so I think for FSG Africa, for those of you who don't know us, we've always been quite keen on the idea that we should not look at financial inclusion as a separate thing, and that we should properly integrate it into a broader understanding of how capital markets and big commercial banks really affect that, how they interlink. And so I won't bore you with the theory, but I mean, just to bear in mind, the kind of the core facts really that include things like, long-term finance is important for priority sectors that create jobs and that allow people to manage their lives, right? So long-term projects need long-term finance. That's why you need capital markets for infrastructure investment and for housing finance and all that sort of thing. And those create supply chain opportunities for SMEs that can benefit from that. And then those SMEs create the jobs that in turn create the demand for financial products. That's sort of one thing. And then secondly, when you think about inclusive financial institutions, when you think about Equity Bank or Capitec Bank in South Africa, when you can't quite imagine how they would have sustained their growth without access to long-term finance and to the capital markets, both private capital markets and public markets. And then you think about the millions and millions of their customers who would not then have services that have allowed them to manage their lives. So I think for me, it's sort of totally axiomatic that both are important and interdependent. Right now, the need for functional capital markets or long-term markets is never greater. So the IMF calculated, I never know how they do this, but has calculated that the financing gap, not need, is somewhere between 130 billion and 410 billion for Africa over the next 3 years. That's the financing gap. And the issue here is that the fiscal space that African economies have is in general extremely modest. And we know that Zambia effectively did already default on its bonds to international creditors. And many other countries are in debt distress. And so the importance here is that the development budgets of these economies, so that bit of the economy that we really care about, because it's about building the roads, it's about building the schools and the hospitals and so on, is going to be really squeezed. Many governments are having to contemplate increased debt servicing costs not least because their currencies have also weakened, and a lot of that borrowing was in hard currency. So the pressure on African governments is extremely intense, which means that they have to think about sort of how you really introduce private money through capital markets and capital market structures into the financing of economies in a broader sense. So on the one hand, I think financial markets are going to be extremely important because they're going to be a source of government borrowing. And of course, a whole lot of SMEs and people generally depend on governments being able to pay their bills. And on the second, I think it's an area where private capital and public capital can meet in innovative structures that allow stuff to happen. And the track record of capital markets is, and I emphasize again, it's not just about stock markets, public stock markets, it's also about private equity and private debt, is not so great at raising capital. But I think it needs to get better at it, and I think it can get better at it. But you know, one thing capital markets do have is lots of quite bright people who are quite incentivized to create structures and that can make these pockets of capital meet each other and in ways that work for all different kinds of investors. So, you know, we would like to see a whole range of different kinds of use cases in capital markets that would benefit the kind of market that you're talking about, like different kinds of collective investment schemes that can be brought on and launched to crowd in capital, other sort of project financing, special purpose vehicles, where you might need regulatory space in order to launch those, other kinds of listed vehicles, perhaps for private equity and private debt. So all of that requires, quite a lot of regulatory inputs, and also requires, clever structuring, I think. But those things are possible, and I think with that, I think we can be quite confident that financial markets are going to play an important role in supporting this segment of the market as well in the future.
Great. No, I mean, I think that's a really good summary, and certainly very helpful for me, because I'm definitely out of my depth when it comes to capital markets and the like. So, Payal, I'd like to talk to you a little bit, or hear a little bit about how the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth is thinking about the opportunities emerging from this pandemic, and how to further the financial inclusion and digitization agenda amidst the pandemic and its aftermath.
Yeah, absolutely. So 3 things I'd like to touch on. First, really builds on what Evelyn was talking about in terms of really supporting microfinance institutions. And really, I would go farther and say we really need to be supporting the entrepreneurial ecosystem and these entrepreneurial support organizations. And so that would be one of the opportunities, I think, to really drive inclusive digitization and to drive financial resilience. I think we just can't think of the digitization of micro and small businesses in isolation. So we do have to think about how we modernize these ESOs. And I really think, if I look at our portfolio at the Center for Inclusive Growth, I think a lot of our grantee partners were able to pivot their service offerings to digital approaches quite quickly, but that wasn't true of all ESOs. And, it was the first time that they had been faced with the urgency to do so. For others, digital has always been core of their work, and the pandemic nearly accelerated their development. So one of the things that we've been doing is actually working with Accion, and we have been working with financial service providers in Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, India, Indonesia, Mexico, and Nigeria to leverage digital tools to support underserved micro and small businesses. So, one of the things we've been doing is reimagining group lending in a socially distant world. We've been looking at how you enhance digital channels, and we've actually been helping these organizations, some of which are MFIs, actually implement things like remote customer service. One of the things we were doing in Nigeria with Accion Microfinance Bank is incubating a digital unit. So within the bank, it not only serves micro and small businesses, but it's actually upgrading its digital channels and is helping to facilitate connections to digital e-commerce platforms as part of their COVID-19 response strategy. So that way their clients could actually sell online. In Bolivia, we've been working with Banco Sol and helping them build an internal innovation hub, and we're providing pro bono data science analytics to help them inform their approach and to think about how they're actually going to grow their digital service offerings. So the first point I would just make is, when we think about digitizing, we have to think beyond just how do you digitize a micro and small business. You have to think about how do you digitize the ecosystem that they operate in, and how do you support those entrepreneurial support organizations to modernize, so that way we can all drive to the digital economy. So that's point one. Point two, in our own work, is that we have been going beyond, because of COVID, we've been thinking more about financial resilience. So, and going beyond just the idea of how do you drive access and usage. For us and what we've seen in the data, I think the pandemic really exposed just the tenuous nature of micro and small businesses and their real lack of financial resilience. And so we actually took a step back, and instead of really focusing on growth outcomes for our programs, we've now reoriented to think about financial resilience. I think financial resilience has always been relatively low among micro and small businesses, and I think it's just dropped even more dramatically because of COVID. And so, that's one of the things that we're doing on a programmatic level, is to really think about our measurement and evaluation, think about our priority outcomes, and to pivot from a financial inclusion or a business growth model to a how do you actually foster more financial resilience. And then the third thing I'll just say, Graham, which builds on the previous points I made, is that we're trying to be more gender intentional in a COVID world. I think what we found when we looked at our own programs is that when we were gender neutral, it actually didn't help women equally as men. I mentioned earlier that in a lot of our digital training programs, we saw that women entrepreneurs engaged at different levels than male entrepreneurs. So for us, in 2021, it's thinking about how do you actually design digital approaches that are gender sensitive and gender intentional. One of the things we've seen in our partnership with Axiom, for example, is that even though the female customers outnumbered the male customers 2-to-1, women weren't using digital financial services at higher rates than men, even though they were 2-to-1 in the population. And so again, the point for us when we're thinking about 2021, when we're thinking about our work, when we're thinking about the opportunities of COVID and how you drive financial resilience, it's about being very intentional about how you design programs and not thinking that what's going to be applicable to one segment is going to be applicable to the rest. So I'll stop there, but those are just a few observations of our own work and how we're going to be evolving in 2021, given this real focus on the need to bolster micro and small businesses.
Those are great points. It always struck me when I was heavily involved with the relatively nascent microfinance industry, how the vast majority of households did not build one business and grow it. They set up a whole series of small businesses in order to reduce their risk. And I think that's sort of where a lot of the resilience that we're seeing, the remarkable resilience that we're seeing in low-income households is coming from. They have a whole series of small income streams, and that's really important. And although it's, one would like always them to grow bigger businesses, actually probably makes a lot of rational sense to diversify risk. And of course, I think, 25 years after the Beijing conference, we've all remembered gender again, perhaps a little late, but it's really important that we get gender intentional rather than tick box gender inclusion, which I think has been a lot of the history. And I like to think that we're seeing that really happening, and that projects are being designed from the get-go with a very serious gender intentional lens. So Mike, last question to you, and then we'll go back to opening it up to the audience who have been very brave and stuck with us in the main. Mike, what innovations, you've always been very big on innovation and tech, so I thought it'd be great to ask you what innovations financial service providers can use to assist the recovery from the pandemic.
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, and I think on this one to be follow Evelyn's lead and be a bit contrarian, as you know, she rightly warned us with just doing kind of digital for digital's sake. I also think that innovation has become or is quite a buzzword in our industry. And I think, the research that you guys just presented, MSC, is really showing, I think, the systematic roots of these issues and how accentuated they are right now. And, to me, the approach can't just be clever. That innovation should be a part of it. We need to rebuild differently, but it needs to be a part of a wise, systematic approach that's really starting at a policy level and looking at the economy and its different verticals in a holistic way. I think to talk about the resilience theme that Payal and Graham, you were just talking about, one of the stats that sticks in my mind is from FSDK, which is that 3% of Kenyans can get $85 together in a week in case of emergency, right? This goes also to Evelyn's work on financial health and a bank account's not going to solve that. There's not an innovative product that we can give to solve that problem. When we start unraveling that problem, so quickly we're talking about social norms, we're talking about confidence, we're talking about the education system, we're talking about equality within it, the job market, entrepreneurialism, the foundations of society, right? And another thing that we've been thinking about and developing work around is the healthcare system, which has been in spotlight. And in sub-Saharan Africa, something like about 50% of the healthcare system is private sector. It's clinics. And a study that was done between March and June of 2020 showed that revenues decreased 40% for those private sector players. And there's not an innovative financial solution for that. We need to start at the foundations of the healthcare system. And innovative finance can certainly help. And that's one of the elements that we would like to bring to the table. But it can't just be that. I think, in terms of talking about what innovation might do, I'm quite hopeful. Graham, as you mentioned, I think it is a part of the solution for sure. A lot of what we're seeing in kind of the more developed fintech markets is quite compelling to me. I think one of the issues that has been, in a sense, kind of an elephant in the room is that the relationship between a lot of low-income customers and the financial service providers there's a huge power imbalance. And that relationship is defined by a business model that's a zero-sum game. And so, to look at what Lemonade is doing, for example, in terms of saying, hey, look, in terms of the premiums you pay, if we're not paying them out in claims, we're going to donate them. So we're eliminating this perverse incentive that the insurance company has to limit the claims that are paid out because it increases the profit margin of the company, right? Similarly, I think we're seeing a dynamic with buy now, pay later, of saying, we're not going to make money off late fees or something like that. We're going to charge a fee in some cases, right? Depends on the business model, but to the retailer. And, so I think an alignment of business models that are actually mutually beneficial is a pivot I would really like to see. I think, we've seen some quite forward-looking work in terms of digital lending, and I fully agree with the reservations or the caution we should all have in terms of how and when it's used. But to looking at countries that do have digitalized cash streams for MSMEs, and saying, okay, well, now we can do use an algorithm to give you credit and design those credit mechanisms in a number of different ways that helps you increase your operations or your margins. So that's looking at everything like what Ingi was doing with PayGo Solar, and then doing top-up loans based on repayment frequency, what Flow was doing with mobile money agents, and looking at their mobile money transactions and deriving a credit score, what Hapa Cash has been doing with in Tanzania, and integrating that into the value chains. I think, and Graham will definitely remember, one of the things when I used to work at Microsave, and I think we wrote a paper on this like 5 years ago or something, was saying, hey, look, why don't we look at payments as a pipeline that can enable all kinds of digital services that are more customized to consumer needs and really speak to specific use cases. And one of the major recommendations we had was make them free, or at least low cost. And what's happened in the pandemic, especially with mobile money, is that happened. Transactions under $10 were made free. Transaction limits were increased. And as Mark mentioned, we saw volumes go through the roof. So part of that was like, oh, the pandemic has created this use case where now digital is better than the analog methodologies in some cases. And I wonder, I would love to see what we've learned in terms of what were those use cases, and when we do make the payment pipeline kind of a utility, what are the demand cases that are emerging from that, and how can we innovate and build to serve them better? Another thing I wanted to mention is a report that I just saw come out from Disrupt Africa that was talking about fundraising for startup and the fintech community. And it said that, there was some enormous amount, like 700 million, well, at least relatively, put into equity fundraising in Africa as a continent in 2020. 90% of that went to 4 countries. And so, if we are talking about innovation, it's an ecosystem again, right? We need the research and development, the talent, and we need that funding. And how can we start reorienting some of that into the least developed countries? Where at UNCDF, that's what we focus on, right? A part of that, we think, and I know Mark at FSDA is doing this as well with FSDAI, the investment platform. We're building our UNCDF LDC IP, Loan and Guarantee Fund, and figure out, as we're building back better, especially for MSMEs, how can we redirect some of this funding into the verticals that we would like to see flourish, to help them take a bit more risk in the times where you can't go out and do a credit appraisal like you did before, to put more liquidity into the markets. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Mike. Yeah, very, very thought-provoking. So Doreen, perhaps we'll have 5 minutes of questions from the audience, and then we'll hand to Sitara. So over to you.
Thank you so much for that session. I think we do have 5 minutes for some 2 questions. Let me first start with the one to Evelyn. So the question is, has the enterprise finance gap increased in the recent year? Can there be a dynamic measure of this gap which can be regularly updated so that the interventions towards reducing the gap can be measured? To you, Evelyn.
I'm the wrong person for that one. That might be Payal or someone else on that one.
Maybe someone can volunteer to pick that up.
There's a lot of ducking and weaving going on. Mark, you wanted to refer to Samuel's question on the Africa trade agreements. Did you want to mention that briefly?
Yeah, thanks. I'm happy to try and facilitate a discussion around that rather than the previous question, which I also wouldn't be able to answer either. No, I just think it's a really interesting issue here. So there's a lot of pent-up excitement around ACFTA. And one of the things that we've thought about quite a lot in the FSD network is the relevance of that initiative for the vast majority of who we see out there all the time, which is indeed the young hustlers who are trying to develop businesses, and sort of you try to think about what's the relevance of ACFT to them, right? And one of the reasons I'm saying that is because, as we know from our own research in the slums in Nairobi, you know, a lot of these businesses are digital businesses, right? That you see. So the people who make the cakes, or the people who sell shoes, or the people who sell you know, clothes, they have digital shop windows and they trade digitally. And so all that stuff around, you know, getting, you know, digitizing a total ecosystem, I think all of that's really relevant to that community for sure. But I'm just also then thinking about what's the next stage really. How do you sort of in some way link that community into a regional trade system? Is that even feasible? And what might the role of the big tech platforms be in helping to facilitate that? And then what's the role of finance in helping make those different connections between sort of fundamentally an informal sector and a regional trade world? So I think it's very interesting, and I think there's a lot, you know, as ever, it's really about reach, isn't it, of the financial system to those, and the utility of the financial system to those people who may or may not want to benefit from that development in the market, which is very important. Sorry, I don't know. That's just a ramble. I know it's not I realise it's not an answer, but I suppose the answer is no. How about that, Samuel? I don't think it is ready, but I think there's a lot that we need to look at.
Potential. Yeah. One last question, Doreen, please.
Sorry, I'm on mute. One more question, the last question here. I'll float it out to the panelists. Anyone can pick it up. So the question is, why can't we have situations like in most sensible nations where long-term leases are, for example, signed, but the rent is payable on a monthly or quarterly basis? Why do private landlords have to further cripple businesses by this unfair practice? Maybe someone from the panel can just offer to answer this one.
This is important because we see rent and utilities as one of the key challenges right now for MSMEs, because most of them are still being required to pay for these. You know, one wonders whether the very structure of leases shouldn't be looked at.
I don't have a sensible answer or a sensible nation answer on this one, but I have seen fintechs coming in to break that monopoly on the long-term lease, or look at ways almost as a buy now, pay later kind of effect. But you know, again, that structural issue, it happens it's big in Korea. Obviously, it's huge in Nigeria and other parts of Africa. Yeah, that's the tough one. The U.S. is having its own heaving issues with leasing right now. And in some of our cities, it's actually an opposite position. We pay on month-to-month basis. We don't pay upfront. And small landlords are not getting rent from their tenants who've either had to close or you know, have moved up, you know, to a upcountry location kind of thing during the pandemic. And so there's so I don't think there's an easy answer to any of this. We are already seeing in small towns the emptying of high streets, you know, as businesses shut down completely. So there's no easy answer. Maybe somebody else has another vision that they've seen.
Any other views? Okay.
Okay, so then let me leave with one comment from Lena Hansen, who's worked in this area for years and is, I think, a close friend of Evelyn and mine. She said, we need to get over the nation state boxes that our financial systems are stuck in and get going on cross-border services that work for mobile populations. And I think this is particularly important in Africa. And Mike was talking about working with the poorer countries. And very often in Africa, the populations of countries are so small that rolling out individual specific solutions for them under specific individual regulatory regimes and requirements becomes cost ineffective particularly in a digital economy. And I don't know whether anyone is working on this, but it is, I think, extraordinarily important that we begin to think in those terms.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Wow, that has been a round of discussions. Graham, thank you. Thank you to all our panelists for that engaging conversation. I'm sure that everyone will agree that we've gained quite some very deep insights from all the conversations that we've had. Now, time is not on our side. Allow me to just call on Sitara Merchant, the CEO of Swiss Capacity Building Facility, to give us some closing remarks. Welcome, Sitara.
Thank you, Doreen. I just want to thank MSC, Graham, and the panelists for a really insightful and interesting webinar. I was interested to hear the different points of views. The thing that's really struck me, a few comments from the panelists that really struck me was really around, you know, our financial systems. I think Mark said this, our financial systems have been resilient, and I think that's true. And so then how do we build it to the next level? I think there was a really strong comment from Pael saying that we really need to be gender intentional. And I think that's something that is so critical in the space that we're moving into and the space that we are in right now. And there are other just really insightful comments. I don't want to take too much time speaking about all of them because it'll be too much. So again, just a short note to say thank you. I think in terms of COVID-19, what we've seen is that it's been really a huge test on financial inclusion. And there's an urgent need for donors, for private sector, and for governments to really focus on supporting low and moderate income populations and particularly MSMEs. I think we need to do, these are so important to have that focus, otherwise we're going to risk large populations falling back into poverty, into this vicious cycle of indebtedness. So I'd really encourage, and really the call to action here is to have donors, private sector, and government to really focus on supporting those households to help them come out of the income losses that they have incurred, to provide affordable and adequate financial services, to really build resilience so that poor households do not have to end up in such a situation as the pandemic has put them in. On the gender side, I think, again, the comment that Pael made about gender intentional, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's so important that we start to really put our attention on being gender intentional. It should be a really strong target across donors, across all the actors in the financial inclusion space. Otherwise, we're going to end up in the same space that the pandemic gave rise to, which is women are going to take the brunt of it. From the MSMEs, I always have trouble saying that, the MSME side of things, I think it's really urgent that we need to provide access and support to these small and medium enterprises. I think both in providing access to financial services that are available, affordable, but also in helping them build their capabilities on digital technologies. I think the donor agencies, they also could play a very strong role in this, and this is by allowing and enabling access to concessional financing modalities, such as mentioned at the beginning. I think, and something that's very dear to our heart and to the Swiss Capacity Building's heart, is really funding technical assistance. Technical assistance that really focuses on developing financial products, services, and channels that really meet the needs of the end client. I think, you know, at this time, more than any other time, I think in the history of mankind, it's so important that we're able to do that. And this is something that we do, but I think more importantly, not only thinking about those client-centric services, but really thinking about how do we bundle, how do we package, you know, savings, insurance, loans, input, technical assistance, all of those pieces to really bring them together. And on that note, I just hope that we will all band together as we've done through the pandemic to really make a difference for these low-income populations and for the small and medium enterprises. Back to you, Doreen or Graham. I'm not really sure who I should.
That would be me. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sitara, for those closing remarks. And we're bang on time. And just to say thank you very much to everyone for all your participation. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for keeping the session lively. It's been very good. We've been seeing a lot of interaction even on the chat group, and we're really appreciative. So I saw a lot of people asking whether we'll be sharing the materials. Yes, we'll share the recording of the session as well as the presentation that Anup did. We'll also have the same on our website. So feel free to look through those. And also if you have any other further questions, just kindly get in touch with us. And we'll be able to assist. So for now, allow me to bring the session to an end and to say goodbye and hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.